Well, spoke to Alan Brough, author of the Jack Malloch biography, a couple of weeks ago, and there's been a very, very positive response, and a lot of people wanting to know more, Alan. So that's why you've been summoned back in the early hours of the morning in Canada to tell us more about the book. So thanks for getting out of bed early this morning.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me back. I think having spent a long time researching the book, to me, there's a lot of fascinating books in it, or parts of it. So, you know, the more we can unpack those, the better. They're all part of our history, which not a lot of people know. So it's an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Alan. Look, let's start. Well, Jack, as we know, he really started flying stuff like fish and things around, and the next thing he was into the murky world of gun running. Tell us a bit about how that all happened, how he got into that.
Well, it's an interesting thing because one of the few quotes that Jack has about gun running is in, I think it was March 1980. He was being interviewed by the Sunday Times paper, and they said to him directly, you know, it was just at the end of the war and the run up to the election. They said, look, you know, tell us about your gun running and all the gun running that you've done. And he actually said that the meat run was one thing, but bringing in arms was quite another. And one slip would have compromised the whole operation. So I made it quite plain from the start, no arms. Not that I've ever actually recalled being asked to bring any in. And that really, and then sort of he avoided any other questions. That's one of the few quotes that he made about that. And he wasn't really a person that lied. He had very high sort of morals. But in that reply, he sort of told a couple of truths and he withheld a bit of information. He was very discreet and he really appreciated or understood the value of secrecy. So although he was right that bringing in arms was very different to the meat run and one slip would have compromised it all, he was also right, I think, about not having really been asked to bring any arms in. And that was the interesting thing, because according to my research, I think Jack got into gun running voluntarily, and he did it as much as for the causes that he believed in than for the fee that he was being paid. And it all really started back in the early 1960s, at the time of the break, or soon after the independence of the Congo, the breakaway state of Katanga had tried to declare independence, and Jack had become involved in flying in support of President or Prime Minister Chombi in the Congo. And as part of that secession, the Congolese army and the Congolese rebels, the Congolese army was called the ANC, and the rebels were mostly Baluba rebels up in the north of Katanga. They were always encroaching into Katanga. And there was a little town called Congolo, right on the border, the northern border of Katanga. So this town was always being attacked, invaded, overrun, and it was very difficult for the Katangese to hold it. And so in about, I think between the end of 1961 and March 1962, the ANC were occupying Congolo. And in about March, President or Prime Minister Chombi went off to Leopoldville for peace talks with the central government. And at the same time, to strengthen his hand, he sent a whole battalion strength of his defense forces up there, and they chased away the ANC and retook the town, which was all well and good. But because there were so few roads in the Congo, the town was very hard to hold and it was easily surrounded. And that's exactly what happened. The ANC surrounded the town and basically started starving the people to death to retake the town. So what Jack got a contract to do is to basically start resupplying the town by air. And that was a daily contract. They needed to fly 1 or 2 flights every day in the DC-4, which had quite a good cargo capacity to get food up to these people. And that's what they did. So for the first week or so, they were doing these runs and getting food up there and keeping the people alive. And as part of the sort of peace negotiations, as it was, the United Nations were very unhappy with the whole idea of Katanga's breakaway, because they felt that that would then break up the integrity of the country. Every other province would declare independence. And then what would happen in Nigeria? Probably the same thing. What would happen in all of the rest of the African countries? It would be a free-for-all. So they were very against any sort of secession. And actually, by this stage, another Congolese province had also broken away. Kasai, I think it was called, they'd also declared their independence. So at all costs, the United Nations wanted to stop this secessionist business. So they insisted, as part of this deal that they'd come to with Chombi, that these flights, because they were getting a bit suspicious about what was in there, was it just food? So the flights had to be checked at the nearest United Nations military base before they flew into Congo. So that was problematic, because obviously it added an extra stop. That meant that they couldn't get as much food there because they couldn't do as many flights per day. Anyway, that's how it went. They were doing these checks, going up to Congo, coming back. And quite quickly, when Jack was doing those flights, he realized that what the real problem was not so much starvation, but obviously everybody was facing starvation, but they were also running out of ammunition. So they couldn't defend themselves from the ANC. So that's really what prompted him to start putting small packets of ammunition sewn into these big sacks of maize and flour and wheat and rice and all the rest of it. So he would hide small packs of ammunition so that you could at least help keep them alive with a means of defense as well. And he had a very trusted co-pilot by the name of Clive House, who basically was in it with him, because obviously Jack didn't want to fly without his co-pilot knowing what was in the cargo. So the two of them and Clive agreed fully that there was a real problem and that they needed to do this. But Jack only ever did it on his flights to begin with. And then his other crews came to him and said, look, we're really unhappy. We see what's going on there. Don't you think we should start putting a few bits of ammunition, hiding it in the cargo to get there? And Jack was already doing that. So his crew had the same sort of empathy with the people that they were feeding, essentially. And that was really how he got into the whole gun running thing. And every day they were getting these shipments up to Congo, and the United Nations at the army base also got pretty bored of searching the aircraft, so they would do a tertiary check, and so they were able to increase more and more the amounts of ammunition getting up there, and for 2.5 months that actually kept the whole town alive and kept things going for these people, and quite soon after that, Jack realized that on a broader scale, Katanga was actually the whole of Katanga was in the same position. So he then started bringing in weapons from Angola, who were very supportive of Katanga. And so that continued. And in the end, really, Jack, for the next 20 years of his career, was involved in gun running. I mean, looking at the list of gun running assignments that he did, he flew guns for Katanga, the Congo. Bob Denard used him a lot in the Yemen, Dahomey, the Comores. The British used him in Sudan to fly weapons into their people. The Biafrans he flew for. He did gun running for the South Africans, the Afghans, the Iranians after our independence. And of course, for Rhodesia, pretty much from about 1973, 74. And about a week before Jack's death in 1982, his Argentinian friends actually approached him about flying in Exocet anti-ship missiles. And that was a pending contract at the time of Jack's death. So from 1962, pretty much right up to the time of his death, Jack continued to do gun running. But he always did it for a cause. He always did it for the cause that he believed in. He wasn't your average sort of mercenary who would fly guns for anyone. He only did it for the causes that he supported. And interestingly enough, he didn't really charge much of a premium for it. Certainly with the Katanga contract to Congo, he didn't charge any premium at all. It was the same price from the time he was commissioned, never mind the fact that he made it a lot more dangerous by including cargo, which he thought was critical to the survival of the people he was trying to feed.
Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember somebody saying that if Jack had actually flown those Exocets to Argentina, it might have impacted on the Falklands War, because the Argentinian Air Force ended up being low on those missiles.
They were extremely low. When you read the histories now about that, they received very few of them. They knew they needed them, and they tried to get them from wherever they could. But by the time they started stockpiling them, the arms embargo was already in place, which is why they contacted Jack to get them in. And a lot of historians believe that if they'd had one more, it would have held the British back for a little bit longer. And all the Argentinians needed to do was hold on until winter came. And they were right at the cusp of that. And historians believe that actually, had they had literally one or two more, it would have really enabled them to hold the islands through the winter. And often what happens, and we've seen it repeatedly with the Middle Eastern wars, the longer you're there, the more public opinion either turns in favor of the, or what am I trying to say? Public opinion turns against the superpower. That's really what it is. Often the superpower is seen to be the aggressor. So the longer the war drags on, the more the superpower or the invader is compelled to negotiate. But there was a growing political move that the Argentinians did have a claim in the Falklands. So literally, if they'd been able to hold the island for those 6 months of winter, the feeling was that public opinion would have swayed in their favor, and there would have been a demand for a negotiated truce, which would have given the Argentinians a foothold in the islands, and ultimately they would have won, because the British couldn't sustain the supply of those islands at such a distance. So it's really interesting, and literally one or two more, they believe, would have made the difference. So it's quite sure that had Jack taken that on, that he would have swayed the outcome of that war. And he probably would have. It wasn't really a cause that he was particularly familiar with, because he was much more familiar with the encroachment of communism through Africa, which was his big concern. But he also didn't like the way that the British had treated Rhodesia, so was quite anti-British in his sentiment. And the Argentinian military junta had been very supportive of him. And in fact, most people don't know, they were subsidizing the beef that he was using for the Rhodesian beef run, funny enough. Because towards the end of the war, we couldn't sustain the demand because people just loved our beef, basically, couldn't get enough of it. So he was subcontracting different suppliers, and the Argentinians liked him a lot. And so they supported him a lot. So he was one of the first they went to try and get these exocets. Apparently they were going to be delivered through South Africa. It was a South African purchase deal, but they needed somebody to get them to Argentina.
Alan, Jack in his travels was gathering a lot of information about far-flung places that few people had access to. And this made him a person of considerable interest to the intelligence agencies. And I think he did become installed in some shape or form with the CIA. But confirm that and just tell me how that transpired.
Yeah, Jack, it's interesting in terms of Jack. He was very involved with a lot of secret services, actually. One of his first ensnarements, as it were, or entanglements, was with the CIA. But he then became very involved with the French SDECE and the Portuguese PRDE. He did a lot of work for the Bureau of State Security in South Africa, and obviously was very closely working with the CIO in Rhodesia, as it was at the time. So it was familiar territory for him, but really the first of that was with the CIA. And the CIA connection really started again in Katanga, or the Congo. The Americans were very concerned about Patrice Lumumba, who was the first prime minister of the Congo after independence. He was really a radical and quite volatile, quite unpredictable, extremely charismatic though, so could always sway a crowd, but was prone to violence, advocated violence, and really oversaw the real collapse and the crumbling of law and order in the Congo straight after the declaration of independence there. And his philosophy was break everything down and let the new society grow from the ashes. And he was very interested in the Soviets and the Soviet philosophies and that sort of thing. So the Russians in the Cold War were really worried about the biggest country in Africa, probably the richest as well, falling into the hands of the Soviets in this Cold War game of chess that they were playing. So within a couple of weeks of Lumumba taking power in the Congo, they started to beef up their CIA operation in the Congo out of Leopoldville, as Kinshasa was called at the time. And really, they had the mission of trying to assassinate Lumumba and replace him with a puppet that they could control. That was really what their mission was. And although they didn't really, they didn't actively assassinate Lumumba, they certainly had a hand in his final death. They had all sorts of strange tactics of maybe putting poison into his shaving cream or all sorts of things like that. Never managed to pull any of those off. But as I say, did certainly influence what went on there. And they found a puppet that they thought that they could control. A fellow, it was a recently promoted colonel in the army called Joseph Mobutu. That was the guy that they thought would be pro-West and somebody they could control. I think it probably turned out to be the other way around, but still that was what they decided to do. So that was really how the CIA got very involved there. And as Katanga went through this, they were eventually defeated in that secession and absorbed back into the Congo. Prime Minister Chombi was exiled and off he went. But within a year of Chombi disappearing, the whole country collapsed into civil war again. And the rebels were encroaching on Leopoldville. The whole country was about to be engulfed in war again. So in a moment of desperation, the central government offered Chombi the position to come back and save the country from these rebels. And Chombi had been very good in the defense of Katanga. He'd proven his ability to win on the battlefield. And he did that really through the white mercenaries that supported him. People like Jack Malloch, Jerry Perrin, Mike Hoare was one of the main leaders there. And people like Bob Denard was very involved with Chombi as well. That was really where Jack and Bob started forming their friendships. So that group of mercenaries had Chombi just basically brought them back when he took control of the Congo and used them to drive back the rebels. While that was all happening, the CIA believed that Chombi was the right guy to win the civil war, but they still didn't want him to have long-term power because Mobutu was their man, and they'd already built this relationship. And it was, I think, a relationship based on bribery, actually. But they knew that they had the means of controlling Mobutu. They knew they couldn't control Chombi because he was an independent guy who was very strong advocate of federalism in the Congo, because he said, you can't control all these provinces. It's such a big country. You've got to allow a degree of autonomy. And I think he was right about that. Mm-hmm. But for that reason, the Americans didn't like him or didn't want him. So as soon as he won the war, they started making moves to get rid of Chombi. And part of that was getting control of the air logistics within the Congo. And so they set up a thing called Operation Wigmo. And Operation Wigmo was really this was in September 1964, thereabout. That was really the forerunner of Air America in Southeast Asia, where it was their transport and logistics airline, for want of a better word, that supported all the military operations and the government logistics. And it was staffed by Cuban exiles like anti-communist Cuban exiles who ran that operation. And slowly and quietly, it grew and grew in the background while Chombi and the mercenaries were distracted by the Civil War. And when the Civil War was over, they started then to look at Jack's operation, because Jack really provided that service to Chombi specifically, and they wanted to try and break that connection. So they approached Jack and said, look, this is a service you're providing, this is a service that we provide. We want to have a meeting to talk about how we can join forces and basically run one operation. Now, I don't know what was actually discussed in that meeting, but as a result of it, Jack agreed to essentially merge his flights and his aircraft and his service into the Wigmo service. So he became basically just a branch of that service. Now, that was the point that I think he became involved with the CIA. Now, whether he was formally considered by them to be an operative, and I think he probably was, not that they ever really controlled him either, but I think those were the terms that the deal was put on the table. Either we're going to squeeze you out or you can become part of the operation. And Jack was very astute. I think he saw the the value of maybe having these sort of connections, seeing what was going on behind the scenes, and having that information that he could then apply later, and basically build up a contact network through that. So that was really, I think, how Jack got involved. And the depth of his involvement really is interesting, because throughout the rest of his career, there's a lot of operations where the CIA basically brought Jack in as their logistics or air transport provider. In 1976, for instance, at the, Rhodesia was already a pariah, and Jack had firmly stated his loyalty to Rhodesia. Yet the CIA subcontracted air transport and logistics to him for their operation in northern Angola to try and seed a counter-government revolution there. So throughout the rest of his career, the CIA sort of supported him on one hand, but reported him on the other, which was interesting. They watched him very closely for the rest of his operations in the Congo. There were also some of his staff. He employed a guy to bring in one of the DC-8s from the US when in the sanction bustings deal. I think it was 1973, the first DC-8. The captain who flew that in had to be flown out by an American captain to get it out of America. It seems that guy was almost certainly a CIA operative, and then continued to fly for Jack pretty much for the rest of the 1970s, or for several years through that period. When the Afrotair pilots went to go and do their conversion in America on the DC-8, I think that was done by United Airlines. On that course, it was all common knowledge that the one American guy that was on the course with them was a CIA operative keeping an eye on them. Very nice chap, apparently. They all were very, very happy with that. So it seems like there was a lot of involvement with the CIA, and I think that, but I don't think that Jack was a double agent. We all know the story of Ken Flower and the concern around him. I think Jack used these Secret Service contacts to basically get business, but also to be involved at a high level so that he could build interesting contacts, both for himself and for Rhodesia. And I think those were extremely valuable. He used those contacts in our favor, I believe.
I have no doubt. I can't believe he would have done anything of a treacherous nature. But talking about treachery, the CIA then turned on him and tried to dispense with him.
Yeah, and that was quite soon afterwards, actually. So I think within 2 years of that first meeting, when he was absorbed into Operation Wigmo, and then became very familiar with all the pilots there, all the Cuban pilots and the leadership of the CIA. About a year after that, the Chombi was exiled. He was, as the Americans had planned, they discredited him, forced him out, and he disappeared into exile back to Europe. And Jack retained quite a few of his contracts through that time because of his link with Operation Wigmo, but his focus was then elsewhere. He didn't have any loyalty to Mobutu, and essentially moved on to other things and wound down his operation in the Congo. But he had a lot of friends still there. He was, as I say, close personal friends with Mike Hoare, with Bob Denard, and with Jerry Perrin and all the rest of them. And what those guys wanted to do is they wanted to start another revolution, kick out the government, and bring back Chombi. That was their plan. And so they started formulating that plan, putting it all together. Jack was very involved in that. And it really started with the assault in the east of the country, where the mercenaries, it's basically called the Mercenary Revolt. They attacked Stanleyville and a couple of other of the big cities with a plan to move across the country and retake the country, bring Chombi back into power. And unfortunately, that bogged down because Chombi was flying back to Congo to lead this revolution, and they believe it was the CIA. One of his bodyguards on the flight was a double agent, hijacked the plane en route and forced it to land in Algeria, where Chombi was promptly arrested and thrown in jail. So this revolution was already literally hours away from starting, and the central government already knew about it. So they couldn't stop the seeding or the starting of the revolution. The central government cracked down on them and eventually chased these guys all of the mercenaries in this column, with about a couple of thousand civilians who joined them to try and get away from the vengeful ANC, who was going to kill anybody in their path. They then ended up at the town of Bukavu, which was right on the border of Rwanda, on the shores of the lake there. And they got surrounded there. They were hemmed in there. And so they basically begged Jack to do airdrops of food, medicine, and ammunition, arms and ammunition, to try and keep them going there. And that's what Jack did over a period of time. And it was a very dangerous operation, because they had to fly from Angola all the way to the far east of the country, do this drop, and then head out. And about, as I say, about almost 2 years exactly from the time that he became involved in the CIA, he was doing one of these flights one morning. And as he got near the target, the Wigmo pilots in their T-28 fighters were waiting for him and ambushed him. And he was in this lumbering old DC-4 aircraft, but it's very mountainous terrain. They're very jungly mountainous terrain. So what Jack did, he was a fearless pilot and really just took the big old cargo plane right down into these ravines, being chased by these couple of nimble fighters, and was weaving through these ravines to try and get away from them. And in the book, there's quite a long quote from one of the guys who was on the flight at the time, saying it was the most terrifying flight he had ever done in his life. Flying through these very tight ravines. They had no idea where they were going. They were just literally flying by the seat of the pants and trying to shake off these fighters. And then at one point, Jack looked up and saw this big rock face in front of them, basically getting to the end of the canyon. And so what Jack did is just really pulled back on the entire stick, gave as much power as he could to try and get above this cliff face that they were flying into. And apparently for about what couldn't have been as long as a minute, but it probably felt like an hour, they slowly sort of started gaining height. And according to this guy, as they brushed the face of this cliff and went over the top of it, they caught all the treetops. And when they got back to base, finally, all the propellers were green and there were leaves in the air intakes and that sort of thing. They did finally get away from the Wigmo guys who were busy machine gunning the cargo plane. There was several bullet holes and they found bullets in the back. With all the explosive cargo, they were carrying a cargo of mortar bombs and all of that sort of thing for the guys on the ground. And the next night they went and did it again and managed to do the drop. And they did several of those drops actually during that time, dodging the CIA Wigmo pilots who are now trying to kill them. But then a couple of years later, the CIA were more than happy to subcontract new work to Jack. So yeah, they continued to use him.
What a story. Alan, he also was involved with some interesting personalities from the British military establishment, David Sterling, the British mercenaries. Jack gave them a hand at some stage, didn't he?
Yeah, and that's something that not a lot of people know, that the British were also quite involved in mercenary operations. I mean, the history now tells us that Bob Denard was a great mercenary, Mike Hoare, but he was considered more South African. But the British themselves had their own, what they called the British Mercenary Organization, the BMO, as it were. And that was started by David Sterling, the guy who founded the SAS, and Julian Amery, who was a British member of parliament and became British minister for a lot of the 1970s and a strong supporter of Rhodesia. A lot of people also don't know that David Sterling moved to and lived in Rhodesia after the Second World War for quite a few years. And it was during that time that he got to know Jack Malloch. And so I don't think they were particularly close friends, but they were certainly acquaintances and knew each other during that time that David Sterling was there. And then at the end of the 1950s, thereabout, David Sterling went back to the UK and set up a security company, as you know, these people always do, and also set up a TV production company. But that was really, I think, a front for his sort of continuing military sort of involvement. And that was really through Julian Amery. He had got to know Julian Amery and a lot of the conservative leaders who were very concerned about the collapse of the British Empire and the encroachment of the Soviets through things like the non-aligned movement and the UN. They were very concerned with how the UN had really shifted allegiance to the Soviets during the Cold War. So what they were trying to do is trying to almost reassert the British Empire and British influence in this crumbling world around them. And that was really how the British Mercenary organization was set up. And that was at the time that the Yemeni king had been kicked out by the communists, essentially supported by Nasser in Egypt. So what Julian Amery was Macmillan's son-in-law, Harold Macmillan's son-in-law, and Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister of the UK. So Amery was very well connected, and so Amery was made the Minister of Yemen at this time. And really, what his job was, because he was saying, "Look, we've got to go and support the Yemenis. We're with the British military organization, British mercenary organization." And Macmillan said, "Well, look, I don't want to have anything to do with that because that's a political hot potato. But I'll make you Minister of Yemen, and don't tell me what you're doing, but you can go and test out this idea and let's see if it works," which is what happened. So Amery then, with David Stirling, placed SAS tactical groups into the Yemen to sabotage, to train the locals, to basically push back against the revolutionaries who were now running the country. And what they did is, David said, "Oh, I've got this chap from Rhodesia that I know who would be great for, he's the only guy that would be able to do the supply runs into the desert. Let's use him." By that stage, Jack had already been commissioned by Bob Denard, who was doing exactly the same thing on behalf of the French with counter-revolutionary groups in the Yemen. So Jack basically just added the British to the list and did supply drops for both of them, quite effectively landing his aircraft into the desert sands, unloading the stuff, and then taking off again on this soft, uncharted desert sands. And again, people on those flights said to me, without doubt, the most terrifying flights they'd ever done. And the co-pilot that Jack used was an ex-Korean fighter pilot from the South Korean Air Force. He said never had he been more terrified than Jack landing and taking off in the damn desert, because really, he didn't think they'd ever get out of there. But interesting, yeah. So that was how Jack built those sort of contacts. And through David Stirling, he then was introduced to Julian Amery and started building contacts and connections at that level with the sort of conservative British who were much more pro-Rhodesian. I think Jack saw that as a means of, if these guys get back into power, let's be well connected so that we can get a change of attitude in Whitehall. And interestingly enough, when Jack started setting up the cargo Oman operation out of Muscat, that was really facilitated by Tim Landon, who's considered to be the White Sultan, very well-connected guy who really ran a lot of the politics in that part of the world. Also happened to be a friend of Julian Amery's and also likely a member of the British Mercenary Organization. So when you start threading everybody together, these guys are all connected. And through things like the British Mercenary Organization and the French Secret Service and that sort of thing, Jack was really building a global connection of a lot of influential people. So his connections were incredible.
Yes, that was a very influential web of people that he was bringing together in a very unusual way. But Alan, talking about shooting aeroplanes down, Jack was shot down at some stage, I think in the Congo. Just tell us about what happened there.
Yeah, that happened in, it was just, actually, that's an interesting story because that was really the end of the Congolo airlift. That's how they stopped the Congolo airlift. And the United Nations had become, they were suspicious about what Jack was doing because they all expected the defenders to run out of ammunition a lot sooner than they did. And so they were wondering what exactly was going on there. And I think they came to a decision probably after about two and a half months of that airlift that something had to be done. And so what Jack did is he had been flying 2 trips a day in the DC-4 to try and get as much food and weapons up to these guys as possible. And of course, when you fly an aircraft at that extent, you've got to have it serviced fairly frequently. So the aircraft needed servicing. He sent it back to Salisbury to get serviced and put one of his DC-4s onto that route, DC-3s, sorry, a Dakota onto that route, and went back to Salisbury to oversee the servicing of the aircraft. So this little Dakota was doing the run. And after about a couple of weeks, he said to the crew, great, just a couple more trips and then you can have R&R and I'll send you back home. And the day before their last flight, they were doing this trip up to Congo. And about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way up there, they were flying along at about 3,500 feet and heard this loud sort of crackle of bangs and everything and realized that they were being shot at and were taking direct hits. So the pilot sort of swerved, avoided, ducked around, tried to get away from, because you couldn't see anything. It was just solid jungle underneath, so they didn't really know where the gunfire was coming from. Anyway, as they got away, the pilot realized that they were losing power, and they checked and they saw a big oil leak coming from the one engine, and they could see that one of the propellers had been shot away, and they also had taken quite a few hits in the fuselage as well, and it looked like they had a fuel leak as well. So they knew that they were in trouble, but they also didn't want to land in that area. There were a couple of little towns nearby where they knew there were landing strips, but they didn't want to land there because they had a whole bunch of weapons in the back, and they knew that that would immediately be considered an act of war, and they would be basically imprisoned and worse. And dying was probably the better option in the Congo in those days. You didn't want to be captured, that was for sure. So the Congo River was nearby, so they flew over the Congo River, opened up the back, and the crew chucked out all of the cargo to try and lighten the aircraft, but also to get rid of all the weapons that were in the back, sewn into the bags of rice and all the rest of it. As soon as they'd got rid of that, they then landed at a place called Manono, I think it was, which was a little bit further away, and they hoped was not held by the enemy. But as it turned out, of course, it was. And all the while that this was happening, they were in radio contact with air traffic control in Salisbury, telling them what was going on. Air traffic control told Jack straight away what was going on, so Jack was aware of what was happening. The aircraft managed to make a one-engine landing in Manono, and immediately the ANC, or the Congolese National Army, surrounded the plane, climbed on board, and with bayonets prodded out the crew. And within about half an hour, the ANC was still thinking about what to do with these tasty-looking white men. And the Italians in that area a couple of years before it faced a similar face. There were about 18 or 20 pilots who'd actually been eaten there in a place called Kindu, I think it was. And it's a horrific story that you can look up, but obviously that was on the back of the minds of Jack's crew. And within about half an hour, fortunately, a bunch of United Nations soldiers, a contingent of Ethiopians, arrived and took custody of the crew. They were a 3-man crew that they took custody of. But they continued to hold them. They didn't release them. They were almost as aggressive as the Congolese army. And in the end, it took Jack a whole month to have his crew released from that area. And it took him about 2 years to get the aircraft back as well. So what had actually happened, in addition to the fuel tank being pierced, the nose cone of the one engine had been pierced, which caused the fuel leak. So they were lucky to survive, and they're lucky to find a place to land, because obviously there wasn't a lot of landing facilities in that area. They were also lucky not to have been given to the central government, who I think would have put on a show trial and had them all sentenced to death. That seemed to be what they wanted to do. But yeah, that was the first of the aircraft that Jack lost, and I think they got away with it. It was reported quite heavily as well, and I think that helped. The British newspaper reported it heavily, and then the American press picked it up as well. And I think on the back of that, they couldn't just kill the crew and walk away from it, which quite often they'd like to do if nobody was aware of what was going on. But the fact that the story got out, I think, was part of their saving grace.
And then you fell foul of the Russian Air Force.
Yeah, that was an interesting story. And that was a long time later. I mean, that was in, I think, 1981. So after Zimbabwean independence, the Zimbabwean government, the Mugabe government, was very suspicious of Jack and considered him really an enemy of the state, because he had been so integral in maintaining the Rhodesian government. So they didn't really like him at all. They wanted to nationalize his airline. Obviously, Jack resisted that as much as he could. But what they started to do is seed operatives into the operation to try and spy on Jack, see what was going on, and try and find ways of bringing him down and incorporating that business. Meanwhile, all of Jack's old clients, like the CIA, like the French Secret Service, these guys still wanted to work with Jack. In fact, particularly the South Africans, they really wanted Jack to relocate to South Africa. They appreciated him and his service a lot. So Jack had these clients that needed looking after and needed help, and yet he knew that he was being spied on and was under extreme pressure from the government. So he didn't want to do anything that would give the government evidence where they could arrest him, because that was obviously the last thing that Jack wanted to happen. So when he was approached by people like the CIA for this particular operation, he told very few people. Literally, I think there was only 1 or 2 people in the whole organization that knew what was going on. And he subcontracted and chartered the entire operation out of Afrotair or Air Trans-Africa, as it was. And in this particular instance, the CIA had asked him to do 2 things in 1981. And one of them was the beginning of the weapons supply to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And I think that was called Operation Cyclone, I think. And Jack used his aircraft and his crews for some of those flights from Europe through Muscat and up into, and from there they got the weapons up into Afghanistan. But it was a tricky operation using his own crews and his own aircraft, because there was a trace of their routes and all that sort of thing. And he was, the airline was trying to operate as much above board as possible. So when they then came along and said, okay, now we've got another deal for you, we need to have flights to the Iranians, Jack realized he needed to take this completely out of the business. Jack was well connected with the Iranians. He'd actually been flying for them and supporting them and doing business with them from about 1976, 77. And that was obviously a different regime. That was the Shah. And they were very supportive of Rhodesia, and they did a lot of business with Jack. When the Ayatollah took over, a lot of those contracts remained because he was still dealing with the same people. And the Ayatollah was very anti-US, anti-Britain, so was also quite sympathetic towards Rhodesia as a victim of Britain and the US. So business continued, which was interesting. The Iranians, when they were attacked by Iraq, suddenly found, well, they'd had an arms embargo against them since the hostage crisis. Now they had a war on their hands. They really needed to get arms and ammunition. So they approached Jack first and said, look, would you mind flying in a whole bunch of weapons for us from China? They cut a deal with China. Jack said, sure, and tried to put that together. It didn't actually work in the end because Vietnam blocked, because Vietnam didn't like China. They'd just been invaded by the Chinese, and they got wind of the whole operation and put a stop to it. But while that was all unraveling, then the CIA came to Jack and said, look, we, under the counter, very discreetly, we want to start supporting or doing weapons flights to Iran. And the deal was Israel had a whole bunch of tank shells that they were making under license that the Iranians needed for their tanks, because they had a fleet of American tanks, but they couldn't get ammunition for it. So they said, cool, these flights will really be between Israel and Tehran, which is an area that Jack obviously knew. And they started putting that deal together. And that was actually at the very beginning of the Iran-Contra deal. And so Jack started doing the very first flight for that. But as I say, it was completely off the books. And what Jack did, and how we were able to put the threads together, is he had an airline called Afro-Continental Airways, ACA. And he used that for the Salisbury-Windhoek passenger route in the early 70s. He never closed the business, though. They stopped operating in 74. But he took that business license in 1980 and 1981, early 81, and re-registered the business in Israel and set up a whole bunch of other shadow companies, subcontracts, and everything to try and hide who was behind it. And on the back of that, also chartered an aircraft from one of his general friends in Argentina, which was a CL-44 aircraft to make these flights. And he got there was a Swiss arms dealer that was fronting the deal, and a British manager who fronted the operation as well. And they did a lot of flights. In the end, they did about 40 or 50 flights between Cyprus and Tehran carrying weapons. But about halfway through this, the Russians became suspicious of this and started saying to Israel, what's going on? What are these flights that are going on here? We want to know more about this. And the Israelis ignored the Russians. And I think history teaches us you never ignore the Russians. And they also didn't tell Jack that the Russians were now getting suspicious, which was a problem, because I think Jack had a good sense for these sort of things, but they kept him in the dark, unfortunately. And I think what they did, they then decided to lure this aircraft into Soviet airspace. And according to the air traffic controllers out of Turkey who were monitoring these flights, it appears that what the Russians did, because the flight was very close to Armenian territory, so what they did is they took over the frequency and started adjusting the automatic pilot of the aircraft and started just slightly shifting it towards their territory. So the crew were an automatic pilot. They didn't really know that they were being brought into Soviet territory. Very subtly, they started luring the aircraft in. When the Turkish saw this happening on this particular flight, which was, I think it was in August 1981 when it happened, I can't remember the exact date, but they tried to contact the aircraft to warn them. And the Russians had a jammer. They were jamming the frequency, so the message couldn't get through. And as soon as they encroached into Soviet territory, the local air defense unit was activated, and they sent up 4 Su-15 jet fighters against this aircraft. And apparently this had happened a few times before. It seems that there was record of twice before, when the aircraft got very close to their territory, they had scrambled the aircraft. The first time they couldn't find the aircraft and got away. The second time, I don't know, there was some other problem. And the third time they scrambled these aircraft, found the CL-44 and started taking it back to the nearest airbase. What they wanted to do is capture the aircraft whole to see what was in it and to interrogate the crew to find out what they were doing. The crew saw these jet fighters, and the CL-44 is much slower than the jets. So the jets were having trouble staying with the old cargo aircraft. So they saw a couple of these Su-15 jets, saw them head off ahead and thought, great, now's our chance, let's quickly get out of here, because they were only literally a couple of miles from the international border. So they turned and started to escape, but there was still a Su-15 jet behind them. And the Su-15 jet turned to try and keep up with them, but because it was going so much quicker, actually plowed into the tail of the CL-44, and both aircraft crashed as a result of that collision. The Soviet pilot ejected and survived. All the crew were killed in the CL-44. And when that happened, obviously there was a huge diplomatic issue, because now civilian aircraft's been downed over Russia. What's all that about? The Argentinians who were involved, the Americans definitely didn't want to have any involvement, but the British were also involved, because this British guy who was fronting the deal was on board the flight and died in the crash. So now suddenly there was this huge cover-up operation, and the cover-up operation really worked well, and Jack's intricate setup really worked well. Nobody ever knew that the CIA was involved or Jack Malloch was involved. It was only an Argentinian investigative journalist about 30 years later who was trying to get to the bottom of this, started finding one reference to Afro-Continental Airlines in secret correspondence, diplomatic correspondence, which was classified. He found this reference. He then started looking up Afro-Continental Airlines, contacted me and said, do you know anything about Afro-Continental Airlines? Because he knew, well, it was fairly common knowledge that I was researching the book, and I'd put out quite a lot of information on the net about it. And that was how then the two of us started working on this and pieced it all together. Had that not happened, had he not got access to the secret paperwork, I don't think anyone would have ever known Jack's involvement. An interesting story, certainly, but that, fortunately, he subcontracted that entire operation. Otherwise, he would have lost his own aircraft and crew.
Fascinating. Alan, we go from running guns to flying coelacanths around.
Yeah.
How did the coelacanth come into the picture?
Yeah, that's interesting, because it really adds a punctuation to the general military and gun running story. As you know, Jack was very involved with Bob Denard. Bob Denard was sort of having, coups everywhere and was in love with the Comores and basically got involved with the takeover of the Comores in the, I think that was May 1978. He took over the Comores and actually had several other coups there afterwards, but that first one, when they took over, the Rhodesians were actually very involved. The Rhodesian military was very involved with that. And so that was a successful coup, everything was cool. And about 2 months later, one of Bob's mercenaries was picking through the fish market one morning and saw this very odd fish in the fish market. This is strange. And mentioned it to Bob. They had a look at it and realized it was one of these coelacanths or coelacanths or whatever it is that you call them. It's basically a very large fish with limbs. And the fossil record, people seem to think this was a transition from fish to mammals when fish started crawling out of the sea. And, we all had our genesis from that. And here's was a live one, and they'd started pulling these things up in about 1947, I think they found the first one. And they'd only found, I think they'd found about 20 up until the time that this mercenary saw this one in the fish market. So Bob then got hold of Jack and said, hey, we've got this remarkable fish. Do you want to come and have a look at it? So Jack got hold of the museum. Him and the curator of the museum took a quick dash down to Mali there in the Comores and brought the fish back. They stabilized it, brought it back, and that became the prized possession of the Queen Victoria Museum in Harare, as it was, and I think now it's held in the Bulawayo Museum, actually. But it was certainly a very big deal at the time, because I think it was one of only 20 that had been found at that stage. And interestingly enough, wasn't the only one that Jack brought back. In about March 1980, just before the election, or was it a bit later, maybe just after the election, maybe May 1980, the mercenaries found another one, another coelacanth, and this was about 1.5 meters long. It was a really big specimen. So got hold of Jack again. Hey, we've got another fish for you. And of course, at that stage, Jack said, well, look, I don't think anybody in Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, as it was becoming, is at all interested in, having another fish, because we've got our own, futures to worry about here. But he made inquiries in South Africa, and the Smith Institute ended up buying the fish, and they mounted it, prepared it, and put it into the where was it? I think the South African Institute of Aquatic Biodiversity, I think is where it ended up, in Grahamstown, and apparently it's still there. And the funny thing about that is they decided that they would mount it with the one side opened up so you could see the internal organs, because nobody had ever seen these internal organs before. So when they dissected it open, there was a big slab of fish fillet left, and they thought, oh, that's a great idea. Let's serve it up to the board of the institute for lunch and see what this tastes like. So they prepared it up with the lovely garnish and everything, and off they went. Apparently, coelacanth tastes awful. That was the feedback from the board. They didn't like it at all. But the display is still there in Grahamstown, or whatever the town is called now. Interesting story. But yeah, I do hear that exhibit is still part of the Bulawayo Museum's display. I think there's concern about how it's being looked after and whether it's going to survive, because it's quite old now, obviously. But yeah, it's still there. Both fish are still on display, apparently.
Alan, let's go back again a little bit to the post-ceasefire in Rhodesia. There was there are a number of secret plans unfolding to take out the ZANU and ZAPU military and political hierarchy in Salisbury and surrounds, Operation Hectic and Operation Quartz. I know Jack had some involvement in one of those, but can you give us the details?
Yeah, it was by the end of the war, up until the election, Jack was obviously very involved with the combined operations leadership, and he participated in a lot of the planning for the big external raids and that sort of thing. So he had proven his credibility and reliability with these guys, and they trusted him a lot. And he also had a vested interest in what was happening in the country. And as you say, Operation Quartz, the plan there really was to take out the Zanla leadership and assassinate Mugabe and his team. And the idea was that while the foot soldiers were all in the assembly camps, they were a good target. They could get them en masse, and they would do an assassination of the leadership at the same time. So that was basically the idea. But unfortunately, the international monitoring force were there, and they were very suspicious of the Rhodesians. So the SAS headquarters was just down the road from Jack's office at the airport, but that was really occupied by the monitoring force, who were watching very closely what the SAS were up to, because they, as I say, were highly suspicious of them. So what the SAS did, and Jack was obviously very involved with the SAS, he had been doing a lot of jobs for them, knew all of the leadership there intimately. They basically just relocated their operation to Jack's boardroom. And Jack had the perfect cover, because he was essentially just a little cargo airline trying to get by. And so they moved their operation to Jack's boardroom. And one of the requirements was really getting a whole bunch of the weapons required for this operation, warehousing it, and then getting it distributed easily. And the South Africans were quite involved in the operation as well. So they'd or deployed some C-130 aircraft and a bunch of helicopters and that sort of thing to support this operation. But they needed to warehouse the weapons, get them to the South African aircraft easily, get them distributed. So it was a big logistical operation. So Jack basically made his warehousing available for that as well. So the whole military operation basically moved into the Air Trans-Africa premises. And over a period of time, as they were gathering the weapons, their whole cargo shed was just full of weapons. Even the cold store was full of weapons, mostly sort of brand new RPD machine guns, AK-47s, all of this type of thing. And how they brought these in is the Cold Storage Commission trucks came into the premises almost on a daily basis because of the beef run. And so in these CSC trucks, they were just stuffed full of weapons, brought in the very same trucks that had been bringing in the beef for the last 10 years almost. But the drivers and the operators were all CIO agents for this particular operation. And it was done very discreetly. Nobody even noticed, nobody knew, even though the monitoring force were walking around outside. On a couple of occasions, they sort of came close to Afritair, greeted at the tarmac, held back by the Afritair staff, and nobody was ever the wiser. The problem that Jack then had is when the operation was cancelled at the last minute, he needed to make sure that there was nothing on site that they could be implicated with. And so obviously had to dispense it all as discreetly to try and take on the guise of innocent civilian operator once again. But yeah, Jack was highly involved in that whole operation. And who knows whether it would have worked. History has written and looked at both sides. We don't know. But it was certainly, as usual with Jack, the plans were extremely audacious and out of the box. And I think that's where you saw Jack's hand in this plan. It's like, well, you couldn't be more daring to try and pull something like that off, which is why I think Jack was so comfortable with the plan and embraced it so willingly. Probably, likely, very involved in the planning of it all originally in the first place.
Yes, I think it was very well planned, and as I remember, everything was very much in place, and there was widespread disappointment when it was cancelled. In fact, greeted with disbelief by many, because most of the chaps on the ground were convinced it was going to happen. But yeah, General Walls called that off at the very last minute and changed history. But Alan, there was also a Rhodesian connection with Albania, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And King Leka, who was quite a big chum of PK van der Baal's.
Yeah.
I know Jack got involved, I think, with evacuating him at some stage.
Yeah, PK van der Baal moved in interesting circles. And obviously you've recently published the biography of PK van der Baal, so there's details in there. But, he was well connected with the European nobility, as it were. And Prince Leka was the deposed king of Albania, or the prince. He had claim through lineage to be the king of Albania. And he'd been living in exile, I think, since a child, actually, in Spain. And he was quite an eccentric chap. Quite a few people think that he was, several sandwiches short of a picnic. But he ran a gun running or a sort of arms supply operation. And I think it was really all about his ambition to finally take back Albania. So that's how he got involved with, arms suppliers, and he had a lot of military contractors and mercenaries that he was associated with. And I think that was really his plan, to take back his rightful throne. But he had a reputation as being this arms supplier. And once Franco was kicked out of Spain, the new government was very uncomfortable with Prince Leka running this operation on their ground. They were much more left-wing than Franco had been. And I think they probably set him up a little bit and searched his premises. I think this was the end of 1978, in December 78. Searched his premises, found a whole bunch of weapons. Now, whether they were there or planted, I'm not sure, but basically said, oh, look at these weapons we found. We're going to have to deport you, and you've got a week to get out of the country. So obviously, the guy's got a huge household. He's got all these, set up there, all these bodyguards, which I think they were Nepalese bodyguards, interesting bunch, and all these goods and chattels there. It's a week to get out. So, but knowing the connection with Piqué van der Bijl, the Rhodesian representative in Spain at the time saw this and thought, okay, we need to do something to help the guy. Got hold of Piqué van der Bijl and then got hold of Afriter and said, look, can you guys get Prince Leka out as quickly as you can with as much as they can carry, and we'll pay you $1 million to do it, or the prince will pay you. There's $1 million on the table to get them out. So Afriter thought, fantastic. This is for once a paid flight, which these sort of things often they did voluntarily, but that's great to make a bit of money, and that's how they did it. The DC-8 was diverted. They loaded up as much as they could and got them out before they were arrested at the end of the week. And the plan was to bring them back to Rhodesia, where he would get political asylum. And that was what he asked for, political asylum, and he came in that way. But the Albanians were very keen to capture him and put an end to this. And that was really, they'd been putting pressure on the Spanish to do that. They got wind of this operation to get Prince Leka to Rhodesia, and they knew that the aircraft would refuel in Gabon, which was an established route that Jack always used. So it was a foregone conclusion. They put pressure on the Gabonese and said, you capture him and we'll make it worth your while. So the aircraft arrives in Gabon and is immediately surrounded by the army, who are now wanting to capture Prince Leka and hand him over. So Prince Leka is going to have none of this, and he's got all these Nepalese bodyguards who are armed to the teeth. They've got a plane load of weapons on them with a couple of suitcases, and the dogs. They had the dogs as well. So Prince Leka himself gets an RPG-7 and is sitting in the doorway of the aircraft, threatening to blow up the whole airport and machine gun as many of these soldiers as he can. And this standoff is becoming extremely tense, as you can imagine. Jack is concerned about this because this is now going to affect his relationship with President Bongo, which was a close personal relationship. So he starts to negotiate, and in the end, the deal was cut that the prince would pay a release fee or an airport tax or whatever they called it. The aircraft would be refueled and they would leave at that point. And once that money was delivered, and it took several hours to organize, aircraft was refueled and they took off and went to Salisbury and landed there. But of course, by then, the Nepalese and Prince Leka himself are pretty nervous about how they're being treated. So as soon as they land in Salisbury, they're ready for another showdown, and are all bristling with their heavy weapons. And it took quite a bit of coaxing to try and get them to settle down, put their guns away, and come across to the safe side, which they eventually did. They disarmed, and Prince Leka bought a place out in Ruhr, I think, and he had a big estate there with his Nepalese little army and his big warehouses of weapons. And they didn't stay there long, though, because obviously Mugabe, within about a year or two, took over the country, and they had to leave in a hurry again. And then they went down to South Africa, where they spent the next part of their lives. But yeah, interesting story. And Prince Leka was a good contact for us in terms of his weapons supply. So with his contacts, he was able to facilitate quite a lot of big deals for us. The first of those, I think, was in about 1976, when we bought, I think, 1.5 million G3 automatic rifles from him, 100 million rounds of ammunition. And that was really how we managed to finally convert all of the Rhodesian regiments from the older weapons that they had to G3 or FN rifles. And so, yeah, Prince Leka opened a lot of doors for us. No doubt he made money in the course of it, but interesting fellow.
Alan, no end to fascinating stories about old Jack Malloch.
Well, and that people often wonder why it took so long to write the book, because I was researching it literally for about 20 years. And every time I thought I'd finished, I'd find another one of these interesting stories. And in the end, it just became a point of, for goodness sake, if we don't print this, it'll never get done. And everybody who knows the stories will be dead. So we really needed to get it done. But a remarkable series of things. I mean, each one of them is a movie in itself, if you think about it. And as far as I can see from the research I've done, there's a lot of verifiable truth in a lot of these stories. In the book, I list a lot of the sources for these stories, and the threads are all there. It's I don't think I know everything is yet, and I have no doubt some of the things in the book are maybe fabricated because that's just how memories are, or memories have faded. But generally, I think that there's one after another incredible adventures from start to finish of Jack's life. A remarkable man, certainly, and an incredible person.
Yeah, Alan, well, going by the response to the last interview we did and to your book, I think it's been very well received, and not many people questioning the credibility of a lot of the stories in there. So well done. And yeah, I don't know anybody who's read this book who hasn't been very impressed by it and enjoyed it. So thanks again for your time, Alan, and good luck with book sales.
Well, thank you very much, and I always appreciate talking to you. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. We'll be in touch.